General Audience number 133 of November 28, 1984. The conclusion. The whole of the catecheses that I began more than 4 years ago, that I conclude today, can be grasped under the title Human Love in the Divine Plan, or with greater precision, the redemption of the body and the sacramentality of marriage. They are divided into two parts. The first part is devoted to the analysis of the words of Christ, which proved to be suitable for opening the present topic. We analyzed these words at length in the wholeness of the gospel text, and in the course of a reflection lasting several years, it seemed right to throw into relief the three texts analyzed in the first part of the catecheses. There is first of all the text in which Christ appeals to the beginning, in the dialogue with the Pharisees about the unity and indissolubility of marriage. See Matthew chapter 19, verse 8, and Mark chapter 10, verses 6 through 9. Continuing on, there are other words Christ spoke in the Sermon on the Mount about concupiscence as adultery committed in the heart. See Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. Finally, there are the words transmitted by all the synoptics in which Christ appeals to the resurrection of the body in the other world. See Matthew chapter 22, verse 30, Mark chapter 12, verse 25, and Luke chapter 20, verses 35 and 36. The second part of the catechesis is devoted to the analysis of the sacrament, based on Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 to 33, which goes back to the biblical beginning of marriage expressed in the words of Genesis. A man will leave his father and his mother and unite with his wife, and the two will be one flesh. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. The catecheses of the first and the second part repeatedly use the term theology of the body. This is in some sense a working term. The introduction of the term and concept of theology of the body was necessary to set the topic of, quote, the redemption of the body and the sacramentality of marriage on a wider basis. One must immediately observe, in fact, that the term theology of the body goes far beyond the content of the reflections presented here. These reflections do not include many problems belonging with regard to their object to the theology of the body. For example, the problem of suffering and death, so important in the biblical message. One must say this clearly. Nevertheless, one must also recognize explicitly that the reflections on the topic, quote, the redemption of the body and the sacramentality of marriage, can be correctly developed by taking as one's point of departure the moment in which the light of revelation touches the reality of the human body, that is, on the basis of the theology of the body. This is confirmed, among others, by the words of Genesis, the two will be one flesh, words that stand originally and thematically at the basis of our argument. The reflections about the sacrament of marriage were carried out in the consideration of the two dimensions essential to this sacrament, as to every other sacrament, namely the dimension of covenant and grace and the dimension of the sign. Through these two dimensions, we continually went back to the reflections on the theology of the body that were linked with the key words of Christ. We went back to these reflections also by carrying out, at the end of this whole cycle of catecheses, the analysis of Humanae Vitae. The doctrine contained in this document of the Church's contemporary teaching remains in organic relation both with the sacramentality of marriage and the whole biblical problematic of the theology of the body, which is centered on the key words of Christ. In some sense, one can even say that all the reflections dealing with the redemption of the body and the sacramentality of marriage seem to constitute an extensive commentary on the doctrine contained precisely in Humanae Vitae. Such a commentary seems very necessary. In giving an answer to some questions of today in the sphere of conjugal and family morality, the encyclical, in fact, also raised other questions, as we know, of a biomedical nature. However, the questions are also, and first of all, of a theological nature. They belong to the sphere of anthropology and theology that we have called theology of the body. The reflections carried out consist in facing the questions raised about Humanae Vitae. The reaction the encyclical stirred up confirms the importance and difficulty of these questions. They are reaffirmed also by the further statements of Paul VI, where he emphasized the possibility of deepening the explanation of the Christian truth in this area. The exhortation Familiaris Consortio, fruit of the 1980 Synod of Bishops, De Munieribus Familiae Christianae, the role or duties, gifts, tasks of the Christian family, confirms this. The document contains an appeal addressed particularly to theologians to work out more completely the biblical and personalistic aspects of the doctrine contained in Humanae Vitae, to take up the questions raised by the encyclical means, to formulate them, and at the same time to seek an answer to them. The teaching contained in Familiaris Consortio asks that both the formulation of the questions and the search for an appropriate answer concentrate on the biblical and personalistic aspects. This teaching also indicates the course of the development of the theology of the body, and thus also the direction of its progressive completion and deepening. The analysis of the biblical aspects speaks about the way of rooting the teaching proclaimed by the Church in Revelation. This is important for the development of theology. Development or progress in theology takes place, in fact, through continually taking up again the study of the deposit of revelation. The rooting of the teaching proclaimed by the Church in the whole tradition and in divine revelation itself is always open to the questions raised by people, and also uses the instruments most in keeping with modern science and today's culture. It seems that in this area, the intense development of philosophical anthropology, in particular the anthropology that stands at the basis of ethics, meets very closely with the questions raised by Humanae Vitae regarding theology, and especially theological ethics. The analysis of the personalistic aspects contained in this document has an existential meaning for establishing what true progress consists in, that is, the development of the human person. In contemporary civilization as a whole, especially in Western civilization, there exists, in fact, a hidden and at the same time rather explicit tendency to measure this progress with the measure of things, that is, of material goods. The analysis of the personalistic aspects of the Church's teaching contained in Paul VI's encyclical highlights a resolute appeal to measure man's progress with the measure of the person, that is, of that which is a good of man as man, which corresponds to his essential dignity. The analysis of the personalistic aspects leads to the conviction that the fundamental problem the encyclical presents is the viewpoint of the authentic development of the human person. Such development should be measured as a matter of principle by the measure of ethics and not only of technology. The catecheses devoted to Humanae Vitae constitute only one part, the final part, of those that dealt with the redemption of the body and the sacramentality of marriage. If I draw particular attention precisely to these final catecheses, I do so not only because the topic discussed by them is more closely connected with our present age, but first of all because it is from this topic that the questions spring, that run in some way through the whole of our reflections. It follows that this final part is not artificially added to the whole, but is organically and homogeneously united with it. In some sense, that part, which in the overall disposition is located at the end, is at the same time found at the beginning of that whole. This is important from the view of structure and method. Also, the historical moment seems to have its significance. In fact, the present catecheses were begun in the period of preparations for the 1980 Synod of Bishops on the topic of marriage and the family, De Muneribus Familiae Christianae, and they end after the publication of the exhortation Familiaris Consortio, which is the fruit of the work of this synod. As everyone knows, the 1980 synod also referred to Humanae Vitae and fully reconfirmed its teaching. Still, the most important aspect seems to be the essential aspect that in the whole of the reflections carried out, one can specify as follows. To face the questions raised by Humanae Vitae, above all in theology, to formulate these questions and to look for an answer to them, one must find that biblical theological sphere to which we allude when we speak about the redemption of the body and the sacramentality of marriage. It is in this sphere that one finds the answers to the perennial questions of the conscience of men and women, and also to the difficult questions of our contemporary world concerning marriage and procreation. Thank you for listening. Behold the handmaid of the Lord, be it done unto me according to thy word. Consummatum est, ad majorem Dei gloriam. Amen.